We'd like to thank the following sponsors for helping provide this video.
Welcome, Brian. Sorry for being a bit late. Brian is a principal Agile coach at Big Visible. He is a passionate advocate for continual learning and improvement, and has a large background in small companies, large companies, coaching, developing, you name it. So it will be a pleasure to listen. I can't wait.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for choosing the Agile user group over getting food, like gasoline, emergency supplies. If you find yourself in a bad spot tomorrow, I'm sorry. But no, seriously, thank you guys for coming out. This is always fun to kind of be involved with this community and share some different ideas. For me, kind of putting together this presentation has been well interesting because my first job, actually before I got out of college, was working at a startup, which went out of business before I graduated somehow. And then I said to myself, I really want to work at big companies, right? Because that's safe. No disruption there. And kind of going back and forth, but the really interesting thing that I'm seeing now is, so working with Big Visible, you know, a lot of what we do is we help really large organizations be more nimble, be innovative, be agile. And I haven't worked on a startup for a while, unless you consider Big Visible to be one. But there's a lot going on in this community, and there's a lot of ideas that they're developing and trying out that are really useful and go way beyond they go way beyond what startups do. They're very applicable to large organizations, internal business units, support groups. So I want to talk to you about some of those concepts today, give you guys a little bit of lay of the land. Sound good?
Yes.
All right, great. And as always, if we have questions, just kind of raise your hand. If we run short on time, I'll just ignore you, and it'll balance out. So before talking about lean startup, I figured it was worth at least kind of looking at the history of the tech startups. And I feel like Dell and Apple are probably two of the biggest examples, as we can see. Dell, founded in '84, initially started with only about $300,000 raised from family members, and just this week, going private again, now worth $24 billion. Apple, founded in '76. They did get some seed funding, about $250,000. Bad month or so, they're now only the second most valuable company in the world. You know, barely getting by, about $400 billion. The two interesting facts about Apple I do like is, one, everyone says that Steve Jobs founded it in his parents' garage, which is not true. It was the guest room. They upgraded to the garage later. The other little fact a lot of people don't know about Apple is there were 3 founders. And in '77, they bought out the third for $800. Might not have been a good move. But what I think is interesting about these is that they're held up, and we look to them as, you know, this visionary person who had a great idea, and they followed through, and they just, you know, did phenomenal. The sky's the limit, right? And if you look at it, even, I mean, yes, in the '70s, that was more money than it is today, but not a huge amount. What's interesting, though, is there's a little bit of a fallacy here, right? We look to the Apples or the Dells or even the Microsofts or any of these in a day, and we look at what they did, or we look at how they started and said, oh, you know, they figured something out. So if we can just figure something out, too, we can do the same thing. The problem, though, is that for every Apple, there were a lot of companies that weren't Apple. And we never hear their story because they failed. And it's not necessarily bad, but it can color our perspective of what happens. And it can lead to a really bad pattern, both in large organizations as well as startups, this idea that we just have to figure out the right idea and then execute. So somewhere, after I think with Netscape in '94 went public, before they made a single dollar for almost $3 billion, we got into the Dotcom Boom. And I think these are really interesting, right? So these are 3 of the perhaps most egregious, right? Webvan, which was founded in 1999, got almost $400 million in startup and failed 2 years later. One of the big financial commitments they had made at that point was about $1.2 billion for high-tech warehouses, before they realized that the grocery industry has razor-thin margins, and they just couldn't get the volume in time for the model that they had built. Pets.com, of course, the sock puppet being one of the most valuable assets they produced when they went out of business. That sold for $125,000. But they had similar problems, some bad assumptions, right? So one of their big promotions was free shipping on cat litter. they lost money, right? They didn't make money on their orders. They didn't think through. They were trying to gain market share. They had this idea that if we can just get to scale, everything's going to work out. Or Cosmo.com, another one where this was the one that would, they would deliver like almost anything that you could get at like a CVS for free. So like the two memories I have was one of my buddies would just order a pack of gum because he found it interesting to see if they deliver for free, which indeed they did for a time. But again, they didn't really work out their business model. And these companies had tons of money. But the problem was they had this big assumption, or a couple big assumptions that turned out to be wrong. And in spite of all that money, in spite of all that support, all that infrastructure, they weren't able to do anything about it. Or they didn't do anything about it until it was too late. Which is kind of interesting. And if we start thinking about big organizations, how often do we see that in the big organization where we start a project, we start an initiative predicated on an assumption that turns out to be wrong? So it happens in the startups, it happens in large organizations, and it can destroy companies. And as we know, it destroyed a lot of companies, right? With the dot-com bust that shortly followed. But something interesting happened after that. So I'm presuming some of you guys are indeed entrepreneurs, work in startups, and what you probably have learned is the people in that industry, a lot of them, they don't do it for the money. They do it because they love to make things. So even though all the money dried up, a lot of them kept building. A lot of them kept making stuff without millions of dollars in stock options that theoretically made them millionaires. And this is where we kind of come to this idea of the lean startup. Now, Eric Ries, who coined the term lean startup, will talk about it because the companies that he worked with, they used a lot of agile and lean processes, and they were a startup. The thing that I find interesting, and I don't know if it was intentional or not, but there's another analogy about why we probably could call this a lean startup. So lean coming from Toyota, right, where emerging from World War II, this was one of their big ventures of building automobiles, and when they started, they were pretty terrible. And they didn't have a lot of money. And if we compare them to the US auto industry at the time, the US auto industry had massive scale, massive capital. They could afford massive amounts of inventory to keep their machines running all the time. Toyota did not. Toyota could not afford the American manufacturing model. And what's interesting is instead they found something better. The other analogy I like is Southwest, right? So when Southwest started, they put together a flight schedule for 4 planes, 4 737s. They only got financing for 3. But they somehow figured out a way to meet that schedule with only 3 planes. Hardship begat innovation. In the case of startups, it's particularly interesting because now we have these companies that are starting. They don't have millions of dollars in seed funds. So they can only grow by selling, right? They have to kind of bootstrap themselves. And that adds a serious reality check, a serious piece of feedback, because if your idea is no good, people won't buy it. And if you need people to buy from you pretty early, you're going to find out if your idea is good or bad. And I think that's kind of the real interesting thing about the lean startup and a lot of these concepts is that what we're trying to do is to learn. Learn quickly, learn often, so that we can build the right thing. Because this, we have to fight this fallacy that there's that one right idea out there, and it's simply a matter of figuring it out and then executing. We don't know what it is, and we can't analyze our way out of this problem. So, as I mentioned, Eric Ries is the one who coined the term lean startup. And when he talks about the idea of a startup and the primary goal, it's to figure out the right thing to build. So what we'll do is we'll walk through some different techniques that people within this field have used and talk about how some of them apply to enterprises, large organizations. If you've ever seen me present, I probably inflicted a slide like this on you at some point. So invariably we come to this question, well, how does this all apply to Agile, right? Do lean startups use Agile? Yes, most of them do. And this is kind of, if we think about, this is probably something roughly like Scrum. And down in the lower left, we have our good old product owner. I have to come clean here. So this slide, some of these lines here, these are lines pulled from big visible training decks. Big visible training decks I probably helped create and I know I've delivered. We've called the product owner the, quote, single ringable neck. The voice of the customer, the decider, responsible for the return on investment, able to answer questions. They always know what to do next. And you know what? If they say, let there be light, there is light. We kind of have this myth that, in Scrum specifically, but I think a lot of Agile ones, where if we just ask this one person, they will know what to do. They will tell us. But the problem is they can't. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times we set up product owners for failure because we say, well, you're the product owner, you should know, right? It's your business, you're the customer, or you're the customer, you should know. One of my favorite examples having nothing to do with technology, the Ford Edsel has a dubious first for the automotive industry, and it was the first car to be built by focus groups. Ford would bring in a whole bunch of people, and they'd say, well, do you want this or that feature? And what they found after the fact was when you ask people, do you want something, they always say yes. They don't think about how it adds up. My personal favorite was they kind of came up with this theory that, this is back in the time when most cars were manual transmission, that it wasn't safe. You took one hand off the steering wheel. So they had this great idea, what if we came up with a push-button transmission? And we'll put it right on the steering wheel, because that's safe. You keep your hands on the steering wheel, right? And they wrapped it around the horn. Do you see where this is going? Unfortunately, they put the reverse right on the top, so that if you honk the horn, you could accidentally put your car in reverse. Right? We didn't test. We asked people what they wanted, but we didn't really validate it until it was way too late. In case you're wondering, the Ford Edsel did not do too well. So, where's the lean startup fit? Right? If we think about our problem and solution, if we know what our problem is, if we know what our solution is, we maybe could even get away with waterfall. I mean, we probably still should use Agile. It's an Agile user group. I really shouldn't say we don't use Agile, but you know, if we're in that situation where honestly and truly we know the problem, we know the solution, these scenarios are probably a lot rarer than we'd like to think, but we could probably get away with a fairly linear, fairly predictive model. If we come to the situation where we know what the problem is, we're not quite sure how we're going to get there, you know what? A framework like Scrum works pretty well. Right? It lets us shake out how we build, shake out what we're building, and you know what? That'll work pretty well. But when we come into this situation where we don't even quite know what the problem is, and we have no idea what the solution is, well, the Lean Startup and some of these ideas offer some really powerful and valuable techniques to help us answer this question of what should we build. So, there's a couple concepts, the key principles. I'll paraphrase before we kind of go into this loop here. So the first two really have to do with entrepreneurship and management. And they say that entrepreneurs are everywhere. That entrepreneurs are not just the people starting companies, they're the people trying to answer this question of, you know, how do we get the right thing to our customers that they're going to want, that they're going to pay for. Or, you know, if it's within an organization that they're going to want and ask more for. And also that entrepreneurship is a form of management. That there's a certain discipline here. It's not necessarily seat of your pants. It may look very chaotic, but there's a very methodical, very regimented way of doing this. As many of you who've probably been on an Agile team could attest. To an outsider, it may look very chaotic. It may look like Lord of the Flies, but there's actually a lot of discipline in a good Agile team. And the same thing with a startup. This is actually a management practice. And then the next 2 points are actually perhaps a little controversial when we think about Agile. What they say is that validated learning is valuable in its own right. That learning is a measure of progress and something that we can report on. And that in some cases, learning could be more valuable than product. I'm just going to pause for dramatic effect and let that sink in. Right? Because what do we say? Agile Manifesto. You know, product over requirements. So, or product over documentation. Here we're saying learning could be more important. Because if we don't know what the problem is, it doesn't matter what our product is. It's probably not valuable. And I believe the old Deming quote goes, right? There's nothing more wasteful than flawlessly building the wrong thing. So, this idea of learning is very, very important. And the key technique, the key approach is what we would call the build, measure, learn loop that you see over here. The idea being that we kind of start, I guess it's going to be right around there, build. We build something, right? Or we have an idea, we build something. We build just enough product so that we can get meaningful measurements. And we'll talk about what good measurements are versus bad measurements. Based on those measurements, we collect data. Based on that data, we learn. And based on what we learn, we refine our idea. The faster we can get through this loop, the better we're going to be. And what we'll see is sometimes shortcuts aren't necessarily bad. So let's start with build, right? Certainly Agile has a lot to do here. You're not going to find a startup. Oh, we have a question. Yes?
Are you going to get back to innovation accounting?
Not too much. I think the idea with innovation accounting is a really powerful one, and it's this idea that if we can measure what we learn, if we can measure our rate of learning, that we can show progress that way. I think the challenge that makes this one very problematic is I've not seen a lot of people do this in practice. The closest I've seen is burning down risk charts. And we can talk more about it at the end. I think it's a really powerful idea when we start looking at the portfolio. There's something there, because if you look at most large organizations, what do we measure our portfolio, our project portfolios based on? Scope and schedule, right? Or scope, budget, schedule. We never talk about what. However, I don't have too much to say about it today, because I think, unfortunately, there's still a lot of development on what that really looks like. But thank you for bringing that up. Other questions? No? Okay. So, where was I? We started to go into here. So the idea being that we want to move through this loop as quickly as possible. So first, let's talk about build. And as I was saying, you're not going to find a startup today that's not using some sort of agile lean technique. And certainly those help us build faster, and that's really important. However, sometimes production ready is too much work. I remember back in the day when I was actually working at this first startup, and I fooled them into thinking I was a tech lead. We were building a product. It was actually really cool. It's still out there. It's third or fourth incarnation, called My 55 or Element 55, to do time tracking for law firms. And really, really interesting. The idea being that you'd go to the website, you'd launch a little ActiveX control. It was ActiveX then. It's probably something different now. And just kind of poll your computer every few seconds and see what application you're on to keep track of where you're spending your time. My big learning is AOL Instant Messenger was a much bigger time sink than anyone suspected. But we would have these absolutely frustrating situations where our CEO would do sales calls, right? Or we'd bring the law firms would come in. They'd kind of hide us because the lawyers would come in suits and we were in jeans at best. And they would do a demo. And then the lawyers would say, well, does it do this or does it do that? Or we don't like this, we don't like that. And we would dread like the hour after those meetings because everything that we just did was going to get thrown out. And what we found was that building was actually a pretty expensive way to do a conference room demo, right? And that taking shortcuts, building something perhaps a little simpler, a little bit faster, that wasn't quite ready for production, could get us more ideas in front of lawyers faster. But that was a late lesson for us. So we have this idea that the simplest, fastest way that we can build something to learn is really important. And that idea of, quote, production-ready code doesn't necessarily hold up here. I think that's the key thing to take away. And this is one of the big differences between what you'll see some people in a lean startup doing and some people in a Scrum or XP type environment. Our goal sometimes is learning. Okay, measure. So when we measure, it's really important that we measure the right things, right? That we focus on what we might call actionable metrics as opposed to vanity metrics. And the difference being, vanity metrics, they make us look good. They really do. Phenomenal. But they're not useful. We can't learn from them. Actionable metrics are metrics that are going to drive learning. So my little question to you, here we go, multiple choice. Which of these metrics provides the most insight into a product? A, 1 million unregistered unique visits. B, 500 visitors who view 2 or more pages. C, 250,000 visitors who engage for 10 plus seconds. D, 20,000 users with registered email addresses. Or E, 1,000 monthly subscribers. A, C, E, B. Could we get B, maybe D, just to get the.
Is the product a subscription, or what's the difference between subscriber and user?
Generally speaking, if you're a subscriber, you're probably paying something.
Okay.
E is the most useful.
Yes.
E is by far the most useful. Because E indicates people were willing to pay for whatever it was we're offering. It's a much smaller number, but that's something that's really useful. Because it's very easy to visit a website. It's very easy to sign up. That's a low barrier to entry. And that doesn't prove my business model is viable, right? Because I'm not making money yet. It just shows I can attract people for free. So no, here, E is actually our most important metric. And actually, if you look at like Clayton Christian, when he talks about startups and innovative ideas, and he'll say that the goal is to get net income, not revenue. Because if you grow revenue but you're losing money, your idea may not actually be viable. if you can be profitable on a small scale, you've got something. You can always learn to scale. But if you can't make money, even if you've got a lot of revenue, you're not in a good spot. So this is why sometimes it gets counterintuitive, but the metrics really matter what you measure. And a lot of lean startup comes from the business to consumer market. So we've got high transactions, most of it being web-based. We've got rapid transactions. We can get subscription type data pretty quickly. And this is very, very useful. Yes?
So when you suggest, though, that that data, whether you're in a lean startup or in a big old company, that's really what you need to be going for. Because that's where I see the number one issue is we don't get to, like, are you really willing to pay?
Absolutely. No, you're right. Lean startup got good at this because if they didn't, they died, right? Organizations have, bigger organizations, they've got a little more padding, right? They could probably get by with less good insight, but this is still applicable. And the other thing we'll talk about is this is also very focused on the business to consumer market. So when a lot of organizations aren't in that space, they have to find different metrics. Or if I'm an internal group that I don't sell, right? My customers are the people that the organization deemed shall deal with me. I can't necessarily measure by how many of them use my system. Other questions? Other thoughts on this? Yeah.
So Amazon.com was not what you would classify as a lean startup. Do you think they could have been successful as a lean startup? And what's the dichotomy?
Well, so I think it's important we understand that kind of lean so this question was, repeat the question. Amazon.com, you're arguing, not a lean startup, would they have been better if they were? And I think if Amazon started today, it would have been. But if you look at it, they actually started in the heyday. But if you also look at what they did, they made some big pivots. They made some big adjustments from their initial assumptions, right? If you remember, Amazon.com had two major assumptions. Does anyone remember what they were? Number one, we sell books. What's the last thing you bought from Amazon.com? Not a book. In fact, actually, when they said we're going to sell everything, a lot of people were like, oh, they lost their focus, they're going crazy. Their other thing was no warehouses, right? When they say we have more capacity than the Death Star, I think was their slogan. They now have warehouses. So Amazon is actually a very good example where they did challenge those assumptions and they did change. You're correct. They predated this. So no, they technically can't call themselves a lean startup. Now they're a little big. But I would say that they use a lot of these practices. Yeah, question over here.
With the metrics, there's a phrase, what counts is what gets counted.
Yes.
And the wrong metric can drive some very counterproductive behavior.
Agreed.
But how do you know a bad metric before it's driven you out of business?
How do you know a bad metric before it's driven you out of business? This is a careful art, my friend. However, I would say that a good metric is going to be tied to something that's going to validate an assumption for us. If I'm a business trying to make money, someone buying from me is usually a good metric. So there are fewer, there's a common set, and usually they're involved with people paying, right? Or people consciously opting to work with you.
Yeah, I think what you're probably summarizing is an outcome metric is better than an output metric.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it, right? That's a very good way. The outcomes that we want when we can measure towards those. All right, one last question, then we'll keep going.
Might be feeding into your next slide, so.
Okay, well, let's give it a shot.
If you have insight into a product with monthly subscribers, how do you tie that to features that you may or may not release?
So you're saying if I have monthly subscribers, how would I align that with if I launch a new feature, what they do or don't do with it?
Right.
Well, there's probably two things in that situation, and one that you'll certainly see with companies. I think actually IMView, which is kind of the company that Eric was on when he talked about this, is you can always watch new subscribers, right? And they would even get so ambitious as to do A/B testing, where they might have one version of their website with a new feature, touting it, one site, one version that doesn't. The user comes in and they might get routed one way or the other. And if more people who see the new feature sign up, well, we know we think we got something. Also, once they're your subscriber, you can watch what they do. And I think with internal companies, with internal startups and entrepreneurs, where it's if I run the project management system in my company, how am I going to know if people like my system because they have to use it, right? They don't have a choice. But I could probably start to look at different metrics, like how often do they go in, right? If I know that status reports are due at the end of day Friday every week, do I just see a wave of everyone going in because they're required, and then no one comes in for the next 9 days? There's different things I can measure. So at some point, you start looking at user behavior. All right, let's keep going. And actually, this wasn't okay. So now we go to learn, right? And the idea to learn, if you look at this is basically the scientific method, right? We form a hypothesis, we build something to test it, we take objective measures, and hopefully we refine our hypotheses. So taking data, taking measures isn't enough. We actually have to test our hypotheses and learn. Now, there's a big risk here, and there's a cognitive bias we have called the confirmation bias. Is anyone familiar with this? Yes, we have many people familiar with this. Simply stated, when you go into a situation with something that you believe to be true, by default, if you don't think about it and you're not careful, you are simply going to create a series of tests, a search to find something to validate your belief, and then you will stop looking. Generally speaking, we will look to prove what we believe rather than disprove it. So if we start to say, hey, I'd like to test this, we need to understand the chances are we're going to look to prove it, even if it's not real. So we've got to be very careful how we test it. This is why actually in science we talk about the null hypothesis, right? We try to disprove, because what they find is that simply showing an action isn't enough. You have to try to disprove it. So we have the same thing here when we learn. In fact, actually, this is one of the big challenges, is that a lot of times when people do this, especially in large organizations, they find themselves in an environment where it's not okay to say, I plan to run this experiment and I think it will fail. Or I don't know what this experiment's going to do. In some organizations, that's not safe. So sometimes what we'll see is that we really have to actually institute a process. David Snowden, a complexity theorist, has a really interesting technique, and his whole philosophy is why fight the bureaucracy. So when he deals with large organizations in situations like this, he has nice templates. And he has his templates of, safe to fail experiments. And the expectation is that if you're exploring something, you have so many experiments that you expect will fail and so many that you expect will succeed. And designing experiments to fail is part of your process. Therefore it's safe, therefore it's okay. So we can kind of fool people. So fundamentally though, this build, measure, learn loop is the core of what we call lean startup. And it is the scientific method. And the idea is, the more we can move through this, the more we can learn, the more we can answer that question of, what should we be building? Do people actually want it? Make sense? All right. And actually, someone brought up Amazon.com. So one last example of learning, because I do thoroughly enjoy this one about questioning premises. Anyone come from a sales background? Okay. What is one of the key rules in sales once a customer indicates they want to buy?
Stop selling.
Stop selling.
Right.
So is anyone familiar with this nice feature Amazon has when you add something to your cart where they keep selling?
Right.
This is a feature that Amazon.com product management did not want. They said it was bad. Everyone knows. You stop selling, right? This is like marketing or sales 101. But unfortunately, a couple pesky developers built it anyway. And Amazon said, well, we got it. And they have an A/B environment, so they can deploy things to a smaller subset and see what people do with it without risking their entire flagship brand, or at least only for a few people. It also lets them compare behaviors. So they launched this in their sandbox. Anyone want to venture a guess what happened? It was successful. Anyone want to guess how successful it was? Wildly. Anyone want to try to quantify wildly? No, that would be nice. No.
25%.
6%. What they found was when this feature was added, the revenue of a sale increased by 6%. Yeah. That challenges a major premise, a major thing that we all supposedly know about sales.
That's net of the sales they lost?
What? No, it was not net, because what they could see is we sent 10,000 people into our control environment. We sent 10,000 people into our variable environment. When it was over, The variable environment on a per person basis, 6% more. Yes, question?
Do you think that had anything to do with the free shipping? And let me give you an example. Sometimes I'll buy a book that for some item that's $19.99.
Right.
And it says, well, but you need to spend $25
Yes,
to get the free shipping, so I add something to it.
Yes.
I mean, I'm just wondering if you have.
You know, it's quite possible. I mean, I think what we're thinking now is another thing is the retrospective fallacy, which is we can look back and we can develop a perfect explanation why everyone should have known this, why this is patently obvious, or why it's totally unique to Amazon and we shouldn't question any of our premise. But the fact of the matter is, I can empirically tell you they got 6% more. And if you go to Amazon.com, they kept it, right? Yeah, another question.
Yeah, since we brought up Amazon, one of your early examples was the sock puppet.
Yes, the sock puppet.
Amazon's premise early on was essentially the same one as the sock puppets was. We're going to grow fast enough to, we're going to stay in here and grow big enough so that we can make up for volume, to be a viable business. How come it worked for Amazon and didn't work for?
I can't tell you exactly, but if you look closely at what Amazon did, they certainly did things slightly differently, at least than Pets.com, right? If you think about the cost of a book compared to something like cat litter, the amount on a volume basis or a weight basis, their margins were better. Yeah. If you look at the fact that they were smart enough to do free shipping at a certain volume or the Prime where you opt in, they certainly did change things. I mean, we can't know for sure, but they did do things differently than other startups. Okay, wow, we got a couple questions. Also, we'll go here, then we'll probably keep going. Yes, sir.
So I think one of the interesting things about this feature is that presumably they were able to track user behavior and see that these were being bought anyway, rather than saying, hey, let's try and sell them a widget because they got a Boozy wants it. Presumably they used the data they had and used that.
You mean the actual engine to show the suggestions?
Engine that shows that what people bought anyway. Yeah. They drove more sales to those items.
Yeah, I agree. And then one last question or comment?
There was a comment on Amazon.com specifically. One of the reasons that they were successful this way, like Google, they made a lot of their fixed cost variable by building their infrastructure in very small units. So they built a lot of really cheap computers so that they can simply buy more whenever they had money to do so, instead of making this monster arrays of mainframes like some other sites.
Yeah, that's a good point. Can't control yourself, Mario. It's okay.
Sorry.
No, it's great.
It's all his fault because of his comment. So with that in mind, are you going to get into, like, with the lean startup mentality, the whole notion of like SaaS? Because to me, it's like, why if you can rent for a while and then scale up as you need to?
Sadly, I don't think I can cover the idea of when we start looking at software as a service and cloud computing. But you do bring up a really good point, which is that scaling isn't the challenge it used to be. And I think that's a really important thing, because if you look at it, what the lean startup really says is figure out, prove your market, learn what you need to learn, scale later. Don't scale first, right? Because actually, not only can we scale easier, to your point, but if you scale too quickly, it's a liability, right? Because you acquire more fixed costs. Because if you invest in infrastructure that was tied to some of your earlier assumptions, your hands are now tied, right? That money's gone, and you're invested.
Yeah, I guess what I was getting to is, you're right, the scaling, you're right, that's a good point, it should be thought later. But even right up front, you don't even have to buy anymore, right?
True, yeah, no, you're right. The constraints today are not the same that we had in 2000. We shouldn't malign too much. I'm sure that a lot of very smart people did what they thought was right based on very hard work. We just happen to know more now with the benefit of hindsight. So, that's how we iterate on a product. So we have an iterative product. But if we add a static business model, we come to a failed organization. And I think this is another challenge where we start looking at lean startup and this idea of validating not just a product, but a whole model, right? So Ron, I don't know where you are. Oh, yeah, if you want to start handing those out, we're actually going to go, we'll do a little exercise. We'll use a tool called the Business Model Canvas, developed by Alexander Osterwalder, which says, business model describes the rationale of how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value. And what we're going to see in here is even the simple exercise that we can fit on one page is going to start to surface for us some serious assumptions that we could use this type of a model on. So things change a lot faster, right? We perhaps could have gotten away with static business models. You know, we've certainly now seen that we need to move to smaller batches, cross-functional teams, and now the argument today is we can move even faster. So we need to now be able to iterate and learn on our organization. So this is the business model canvas. It's a fairly simple thing. The idea is that it should tell a story, and we're going to walk through it. My apologies that I know the printout, the resolution of the printer wasn't what I thought it would be, or I'm not quite sure. You can't read some of the details, but that's okay. We're going to get the general idea. So what we have here is a canvas. Generally speaking, if you do this as a real exercise, I would print it out on a big sheet of paper, use stickies. It's meant to tell a story, and it's going to walk through your business. So starting in the... Are we good? Everyone has that? Okay. So what are the elements that make this up? Don't worry about reading the text. We're going to explain what each one is. So first, on the right-hand side, we have customer segments. For whom are we creating value? Who is our customer? Don't need to answer yet, but customer segment. Who is the customer? Who is the user? Who are we selling this to? Value proposition in the middle. What is it that we're going to deliver? What value are we going to deliver to them? Now you're going to notice that between your customer segment and the value proposition are two things. The channels. How will we get in touch with our customers? Do we do face-to-face selling? Are we mass market? Do we build an intimate relationship? Are our customers faceless people? Nothing is bad, it just is, right? What channels do we use? What does that look like? And of course the other one, what type of relationship do we have with our customers? Do we know a lot about them? Do we not know a lot about them? Are they repeat customers? Are they new customers? What type of relationship? These two boxes kind of define how we get that value proposition to our customers, on the right-hand side. Then we go down, revenue stream, right? What are our sources of revenue? How do we make money by doing this? How do we deliver, how do we actually make this a viable, ongoing concern? Compared to, on the left, what's the cost structure, right? You don't have to include everything when you do this. I think the key thing is what are the driving costs of your business, your program, your project, whatever it may be. What are the driving costs? How much is this going to cost? Key resources would represent those key resources, be they people or assets that we need in order for this to work. Key activities, what do they need to do? So you notice we're kind of on the right hand dealing with the people in the problem domain. We're moving to more and more operational. And then last on the left, who are the key partners that we need to partner with, that we need to work with? Who are they that are going to help us achieve whatever it is? Now the idea is that this is going to tell us stories. So actually we're going to do an exercise, and I'm going to want you guys to work at least in a group of two, where one of you is going to pick, could be an internal project, program, something, and you're going to build a canvas and tell the other person about it as you go. A great strategy would be to start on the right and work left. Eventually go down, don't forget about cost and revenue. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about this. As some of you guys see, there's a website. This tool is in the Creative Commons, so you're welcome to use it with attribution, as I am, developed by Alex Osterwolds. So at first, we can use this just to talk about a project. In fact, actually, when I work with teams now, one of the first things we'll do with a product owner is we'll give them this canvas and we'll say, let's just talk about what you're building. And it's kind of funny because people at first are taken a little aback because it looks so simple, and yet the conversations that you find are really, really fascinating. I've seen a product owner get into this existential discussion about are they building something internally or to sell abroad, or to sell to the market. And if they sell it to the market, it will compete with their own company. And this little thing just kind of surfaced this hugely profound discussion that no one was really talking about. We've seen some really, really interesting things. Another one where this project was suffering from horrible scope creep, right? It was originally supposed to create a proposal. I believe when last we checked, it was going to do project management, forecast revenue, manage cost, and automate the workflow of several business departments. So we had them do a canvas, and what we saw is they homed in on a couple panes. A couple panes that a lot of those features didn't talk to, and it helped them focus and build a better product. So just doing this type of exercise alone can be a great way to just get a basis of what we're doing. And I should give my disclaimer, this can be for internal users too, right? So we use the term customer with a little creativity, right? They could be internal users, they could be stakeholders, they could be the people that you serve if you're an internal group, right? Our value proposition could be, again, something that we're delivering that people aren't directly paying for, right? Cost and revenue, there might be internal measures that we can use to drive this. One of the ones I always find interesting, if any of you guys have worked for a bank and worked with a risk management group, they will argue that they are a profit center. Because they will argue every dollar of fraud they prevent is extra profit. And when they do that, man, they get a lot more funding. A lot more funding. Right? So this doesn't have to be selling a service or something to customers, right? You can absolutely use this model internally. A few things look a little different. Channels frequently becomes less interesting. You know, my favorite one is, how do we talk to our customers? They have to talk to us. Management says so. Key partners, again, can be internal. So that's the first level. So I'll tell you what, before we go on to the second level, how about we just take like 5 minutes, and working in groups of 2 or 3 if you're inconveniently aligned. I want you guys to fill out one business model canvas talking to the other person. You really want to be able to tell a story here. And the easiest, simplest way would be start on the right and work left. All right? 5 minutes? Before we keep going, I guess I'll just open up the floor. If we have any questions or observations from this exercise. Yeah?
I have an observation.
Hey guys, I'll tell you what, could we let one person go? So you have an observation?
Yeah. The product is an internal product, but in some cases, there might not be a difference between partners and customers to the right.
Do we have a second mic? Or do you want me to run? So your comment is an observation that sometimes you're saying key partners and key resources? Customers. Oh, your customers and your partners look very similar.
For some internal products, the partners and customers may be the same people.
Quite possibly, yeah. I think a lot of times on the internal you might see partners or other groups that help you serve the customers, right? So if you're in an SG&A type area, there are other SG&A type groups who aren't quite your customer. You guys are working together to serve someone else. Other observations? Yeah.
There are always many, many potential value propositions.
Many, many value propositions. Out of curiosity, anyone get more than, I don't know, let's say 5 value propositions? More than 5? More than 3? 3. 3, okay. Yeah, you actually probably want to be careful that you don't get too many. And sometimes you'll see that column will just get filled up with thing after thing after thing where, you know, it's kind of like that project, we try to make it do too many things. Sometimes actually, when we do an exercise like this, you might actually put like a width limit on a section. So we'll say go nuts at first, and then say you can only pick 3. 3 is usually the number I'll use. Other observations? Yes, Ron.
Quickly challenge some of our assumptions.
It challenged some of your assumptions. Mm-hmm. Oh, you're like leading into my next slide. Okay. But that's great, because that's exactly what this frequently does. As we start to talk about it, we invariably come to this question of, how real is this, right? What was I really assuming when I defined this business model? So then we come to kind of this next step of, you know, so to your point, level 2, we develop hypotheses. We start to challenge assumptions, form new assumptions, become aware of assumptions we may not have become aware of, right? Now we're ready to kind of do that build, measure, learn. We want to actually think about how would we validate those assumptions. So we're doing one more exercise, and I'll give you guys a couple hints. Where do you think your biggest, riskiest assumptions are? Any guesses on your canvas?
Value proposition.
Value proposition. It's a good one. Other ones? Revenue streams. I would say it's your customers. Yeah. Who's your customer? Do you really know them? Right? So we might start looking at, there are some analysis techniques, and a lot of these sadly go beyond what we can do in a little bit over an hour. We start looking at empathy maps or personas. But surveys, A/B analysis, we can start to look at how do we get to learn what our customers are doing, who they are, what really matters to them. We can start to make tests to validate that section. And actually, I forgot we said it over here. Yep, value proposition is the other very, very risky section. Those are probably the two where your biggest assumptions are that could kill you as a business. Right, so here, again, we need to think about, is there segments, how do we validate or invalidate? So what I want you guys to do, and revenue and costs certainly are going to be kind of the next ones. So what I want you guys to do is, we'll do like 3 minutes. I'll kind of watch the clock closely. I want you guys to take at least one of your business models and identify at least one key assumption and one way you could test it. You could validate it. Okay? We'll go for like 3 minutes. At least one. If you get more than one, just keep going. Anyone want to share an assumption and a test that they developed? Anyone? Sure, in the back.
So I work for EBSCO Publishing, and the things that I do, I'm a dev manager. And what our customers are internal editors, and they write abstracts. So essentially, we do research databases. We give them all the articles they can, and then we data mine them. They're able to search. They look at the article, and then they write the abstract. So what we do is to expedite or help them through. We give them tips on the right side, saying, you've already written an abstract, and these are the ones that you have, or somebody, Library of Congress has written one. And we've seen that, and we run this in Checkpoint Zero, which is like a proof of concept. So let's say we had 3 requirements that they'd like. We do kind of skeletal versions of some of the ones they tell us the most important. Run a POC for a couple of weeks, give them the URL, they test it, and we see which one they like the most. They give us feedback. And so that's how we validate which is the one that we hit first in that first check.
Cool. And that's something you do today? That's something you do today?
Yes, we do that
Nice.
today.
Excellent. One more example, a key assumption they saw on their canvas and how they test it. Sorry, Marina, we're going to make you run. And then we'll go over here for one more. So first, the assumption you guys have.
Okay, so we have an assumption that job sharing is a value proposition that can be sold to a business, but the assumption that we wanted to test was that you can match 2 people together to produce as much value, if not more, than a full-time employee. So the test would be to come up with a means by which you identify people who have an interest in job sharing, that can establish a certain amount of trust in the person that they would job share with, and then ultimately to have a process that could be repeatable.
So basically your test would be to try it out with a couple in a small controlled experiment or something?
Yes.
Cool. So one more example. No?
Yes.
Oh, we're going to take, good, and in the general vicinity.
So our assumption was that nonprofits would be looking for ways to use social networks to better understand potential donors and their existing donors. And so what we thought we would do is, do data mining with a certain subset of social media, and then share that data with executives at local nonprofits and discuss ways in which they would use it and whether it would be beneficial or not.
Cool. Thank you guys for sharing. So hopefully what you're seeing though is coming up with good tests is actually really hard. And a lot of times, when you remember, you probably have to build something, right? So chances are we don't want our test to be, I'm going to go do analysis, right? We need to try something and see what happens. So a lot of times, the other dimension that we come to is how do we test as quickly and cheaply as possible? One example I really like is non-technical, but actually from a fellow Agilist. I don't know if any of you know Pat Reed, who is one of the founders of the PMI Agile Community Practice, working over at Gap. So Gap developed the high-end Athleta brand, and they began to get feedback from a lot of people saying, you want us to buy this really, really expensive clothing and footwear and stuff, and it's cool, but I'd like to see it in a store. So they had this big assumption of if we build a high-end Athleta apparel store, will people buy? Big assumption. So they went to kind of the Gap retail group and said, we'd like to build a store for this specific brand. How long would it take? And they said 1.5 years. And that's because the Gap infrastructure group's job is to figure out a cost-effective way to build a lot of stores, right? And Gap knows they can do that. That's not their risk. Their big question is, will people buy this brand? So actually, it was I think it was a technology group that actually built the pilot store, not the store line of business. Because they said, okay, if we can do it and we can pull it off, we'll turn it over to you, right? And they didn't do it with the standard Gap infrastructure. I think actually they used like QuickBooks for their accounting, but they turned it around in about half the time and were able to prove the idea. The key risk wasn't, can we build another store at a low cost? They know they can do that. Their real question was, will people buy this product? So finding those key tests, which really have to be building something, very, very important. So, all right, Mario, one quick question.
It's more of a, you brought up a point though, which is another risk is when you're dealing, you brought up a point, which is, I'm lauding you for a lot of points you're bringing up.
Then go on. You guys can wait. Yes, please.
That oftentimes you bump into the organization, the static that you talked about, that there's a static approach to how to build out stores. And so that was actually a risk. So they had to figure out a way to get around some of the staticness that's going on.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think it was focused on the wrong risk, right? Because that wasn't terribly risky that they'd be able to build this specific store in a scalable pattern. It comes back to that the software as a service. Scale after. Prove the idea, then scale. And that's exactly what they did. So right around now, as we talk through this, I'll bet you a lot of you guys are thinking, this is all wonderful, but I don't work for a startup, right? And if you're not working for a startup and you're working for a big company, well, let's be honest, startups can take more risks because they have less to lose, right? A startup inherently doesn't want the status quo because in the status quo, they're in their parents' garage. I'm playing to a stereotype. But so when we move to a big organization, there's a higher risk, right? When we start looking at internal groups, we don't necessarily sell to customers. Or if we're in a B2B market, the quantity and the volume of our sales is very different. I can't do that type of A/B test like we talked about with Amazon. And those releases can take us a long time. So just a couple quick thoughts on how we're doing this in the big organization. First, we have to make it safe to test. And I think making that safety is really, really important. Acknowledging what some of these costs are and mitigating them, right? So like one common one is this idea of the A/B test. One company I was working at, we didn't call it Lean Startup, but there was a lot of similar things. They're building this brand new website, big, prestigious financial service company, brand new website, and they were very worried that if we came out with this kind of edgy Web 2.0 website and it didn't work or it was poorly received, it would forever tarnish their brand, right? Irrevocably. It's kind of a bad fallacy, but so what we were able to do though was to come up with the sandbox or the tar pit, right? Where we could send a small amount of traffic and we could see what happened. And if anything went bad, we could just stop sending traffic to it, and no problem. So we were able to experiment like that. We made some safety there. Another one you'll see with companies is different brands, right? When Delta decided to make a low-cost carrier, they didn't rebrand Delta, they launched Song. Gmail had that little beta on it until 2009. When did you guys start using Gmail? And what's interesting is that even after that, they created Google Apps, which is pretty clear about what it is. And you look at Toyota, which has had a phenomenal brand, and they will continue to innovate by building new brands, right? Scion and Lexus. And then near and dear to my heart, in Big Visible. As most of you guys know, we make this little free tool called See Now Do. In 2008, we were very, very worried that if we launched See Now Do and people didn't like it, it would tarnish the Big Visible brand, such as it was in 2008. And actually, if you use the Wayback Machine or you look, for several years when the See Now Do was out there, it only said like Big Visible in the lower corner. It was separate branding because we didn't want to take the risk. So sometimes that sandbox is theoretical. It's in our mind, right? Another way that we can be cheaper is Wizard of Oz testing, right? Or basically a man behind the machine, where we don't actually build. We just get enough people to manually do what it is. So there was one startup that was actually building a grocery list, a personalized grocery list, right, for $10 a week. And what they actually did first was they found customers. And for their first few customers, they literally the vice president of product development would literally write the grocery list and collect the $10 check. And only after they had enough customers and they had a model that worked, did they go get developers and did they actually build a system, right? So sometimes, we need to test with something, but something it doesn't have to be code. Failure can be a good thing. This is my son, Trevor. I really enjoy skiing. So this was a critical test for me this winter of getting him to ski. And this is the point where we reached a turning point. Because the first time I took him skiing, he was actually very terrified. We lasted about 5 minutes, and then he had to go in. It cost me a lot of hot cocoa. The second time, though, he fell. He fell very quickly, and he realized it was fun. And then he realized falling doesn't hurt, and we were able to have a lot more fun and do a lot more. And I think likewise, we need to make an environment where we have to show that failure is okay. And going back to that idea where, if you do this in a strategic way, define your process and say part of our process is to define things that we intend to fail and to take that stigma away. It's part of how we're going to learn. And if we can make it safe, we can do a lot more experimenting. I'll tell you what, I'm going to just hang for questions because we're a quarter of, and I don't want to be the reason if you guys are here late. So the one other thing we talked about a little bit when we talked about measures for learning, this is the Pirate metrics as developed by Dave McClure, R. And for startups, these are the key ones they look for in business, customer, or like B2C type ventures. So it's acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. Got the picture? Okay, good. This is great, but again, a lot of large organizations, we're not selling to customers, right? We have to look at other things, behavior-driven. One of the cool things with internal organizations is that we get a lot more data about our customers, right? Because we can go visit them, we can watch them. They don't have a lot of privacy rights. So, going back to this one where the group is working that has a project management tool, we can watch what people do exactly on that system, when they do it, how they do it. We can see if business policies adjust how they do it. So we can watch that, right? They're not going to buy from us, but we can see, do they use the system to bare minimum when they're forced to? Do they willingly go into it? How often do they go into it? Do they make regular updates, or is it just, again, when forced? We can also do some other interesting things like get feedback. So one of the other really cool ones coming out of Cognitive Edge is this idea of user journaling, right? Where we just ask people to explain their experience and index it. We don't index it, we let them do it. And actually, if you go to Cognitive Edge, or I think the tool is called User Voices, the cool demo, it's just a little button, and any given point on the website, you can just hit it and it says, give us feedback, right? And you can usually categorize it or tag it. And the idea is that we can start to look for trends, like, oh wow, when everyone goes to this page, they say, I dislike this. Or they give us other feedback and we can look for patterns. So a lot of times when we're in this internal area, we have to look more at behaviors or what users are saying, but we can still get pretty good feedback. Oh, wrong way. If we put it all together, and if you guys take very little from this other than this, you're still in good shape. This business canvas is going to drive a lot of assumptions. It's going to drive a lot of things. We may go on and do user persona development or empathy mapping, but coming out of this, we're going to have hypotheses, we're going to have things that we want to validate, and those things should find their way directly into our backlog, which will prioritize as features to learn. And hopefully this kind of goes back to that earlier question we talked about innovation accounting. As we start to measure hypotheses that are validated or disproved, our learning, we can start to measure progress towards discovering exactly what it is that we want to build. So our basic mechanics of building a backlog, building out a release, still hold up. But now we have another tool to fill that backlog with things that are going to help us learn, not just deliver features. Another thing, if we're just thinking of one small thing, if you use a Kanban board, as most teams do, add one more column at the end after done, and call it validate, or get info, or learn, right? After we build a feature, figure out how do we validate that it did what we thought it did? How do we figure out the impact that had on our business? Just making that one little step, asking that question. It doesn't have to be anything terribly rigorous, but it will help us learn a lot more. Other things, if you want to learn more, there is actually a Lean Startup group in Cambridge. It is at the Microsoft Nerd Center, which hopefully some of you guys know from prior events. I will give you 2 warnings from my first time there. One, don't be surprised if people come up to you and say, what companies have you founded? Also, they serve pizza and soda, don't ask for water. just take your cola and be happy. But they're actually, no, it's a really great group. It's a lot of fun. It is, of course, it's like a lot of these user groups. It is free, and you get to interact with a lot of people around this. So with that, I'm not sure how much time we have, Marina. I think we got right to 20 after. Do we have time for questions, or should we? 2 questions. Do you have your mic? You ready to run? So, do we have any questions over here? No, questions in general. 2 questions. I've been given budget for 2. 1 over here.
So in the build-learn cycle, you mentioned doing, don't worry about production-ready code and so on. At what point do you make it production-ready? At what point do you decide this experiment is good enough to start investing in, especially as we scale?
I think that's the hard work that people have to figure out on their own, right? I mean, so, and I hate to give a coy answer, but like I don't think it's formulaic, right? So when you have seen that when you look at your business canvas or however you're assessing your risks and your assumptions, when you say I've confronted the key risks and I'm ready now, right? And it should be pretty quick, right? Because ideally we're going to then further validate by selling even more, by materializing these ideas. So it should be pretty quickly, but it's really going to be once I've answered that question, then I scale, then I build. If it's more than months, like a few months, you're probably waiting too long.
I ask that just because I've seen several organizations that are following sort of a lean startup approach use that as an excuse to never productionize anything, and then they wonder why they can't do anything a year later.
The best feedback is always going live, and always has, always will be. So if you're waiting very long, you're waiting too long. I mean, if you look at some of these companies, they're doing hundreds of releases to production every day. Okay, one last question. Anyone? No, we're all happy. All right. Well, thank you very much.